Hey, what's up everyone? This is Vegetarian Zombie here again, and I want to welcome you back to Beginning C# with Unity video tutorial series. In this video, we're going to be covering methods, but before we do that, we're going to dive into your challenge in your last video, and that was to create a namespace for your alien object. And it could really be anything that you wanted to, the name. Typically, the naming conventions are your company name followed by the technology type, and that's straight from Microsoft. All right, we're going to open up our monodevelop here, and here we have our alien struct. I'm going to encapsulate this within a namespace. So we're going to call this namespace, and I'm going to call it Jesner. I have a website called Jesner, which I haven't updated in some time, and we'll just call this C# like this. And we have to put an open brace, and when there's an open brace, we have to have a closing brace. And I'm going to shift this over. I'm going to shift it by hitting Command right brace, or you can hit Command left brace, and that will move them back and forth like so. And I believe that would be the control on a Windows computer. So we have namespace jesner.c#. Now we're going to return back to hello world. And to gain access to that, we can just type using jesner.c#. Now we have access to that namespace. Notice that there aren't any compile errors when I build, and that's because we're referencing the alien directly now from this namespace. If you have any questions about this, definitely leave me a message in the comments. In this video, we'll be covering methods. If an object is like a noun, then a method would be the verb. And a method is what you want the object to do. For instance, you may want it to fire a bullet, so you would have a fire method. You may want to set a field on it. You would have a set method. You may want to get information from an object, so you would create a get method. A method is simply a line of code that you write that you can have your object do. Believe it or not, we've been working with methods since the start of this series. When we've been writing everything within the curly braces of onDisable, we've actually been writing what is known as the method body. What you'll be learning in this is how to write the method signatures. Okay. Let's break it down. A method signature can contain several components, and I'm not going to cover everything in this video. I'm just going to cover enough for you to get started. The first one is an access modifier. Now, we covered access modifiers in the last video, so if you have any questions about them, check out the last video. But the way you can think of an access modifier is whether someone outside can access this method. And generally, you're going to have public, or you can have private. Again, we'll be using protected, and you'll see how that comes into play later in this series. But for now, let's just think about public and private. A public method means anyone outside this object can access this method. A private method means only the object can access that method. For methods that don't have an access modifier, then they will be private by default. But again, I highly recommend that you designate your access modifier explicitly. Why would you want to have a private method? The answer is there are times when you want your object to do something, and this may manage the internal state of the code. For instance, it may update the hit points, or it may calculate, say, certain interest rates, or whatever is necessary for that object to function. Now, you could put all this code inside a giant method that will update once, but you want to take your code and you want to break it down into really small bite-sized pieces. Ideally, your methods should be compact, and they should be doing really one thing. If you find your methods growing too large, what you should do is break those methods down into smaller methods. And that way you can see the machine, so to speak, and understand if something is going wrong, where to look. Okay, so we have our access modifier. Next, we have the return type, because methods can return a value. And these are just basic types. They can return ints, strings, anything you want. They can return other objects like structs or classes. You just define the type that it's being returned right after the access modifier. If there is no return type, meaning you just want to do some processing and that's it, simply designate it as void. A void method returns nothing. And again, you've seen this before with onDisable. OnDisable is a method that returns nothing, thus it's designated with void. Next, you give the method a name. And you want to give your method something that is descriptive, that tells what the method does. I tend to do something like do something, like verb followed by a noun, get data, set data, and so forth. Once you have the name set, you're now going to provide the parameters. The parameters are any variables you want to pass into the method so that the method can possibly take those into account when doing its calculations. What you do is inside the parentheses, you put the type followed by the parameter name. And after that's done, you just put a comma between each one, and you can have as many parameters as you want. Then you'd put your closed parentheses, an open curly brace, and a closing curly brace. And between the curly braces, you would put your method body, which is what we've been doing. Now, a quick note about the parameters. The parameters, any data you pass into the parameters, that data is going to be copied. Meaning, if you have a variable called x, and x equals 5, and you pass that variable into a method, and inside that method you alter the variable 5, it's not going to change the value of x outside of the method. And I'll demonstrate this in just a moment. For methods that are returning values, what you're going to do is you're going to choose a value that you're going to return, and you're going to use the return keyword. Then put a variable or the value or expression that you're going to return. Once you use the return keyword, then the code path will immediately exit that method. Meaning, if you have any code after the return statement, then that code is not going to run. Now, calling methods is very simple. You just take your object that you're doing and use the dot operator. Then you just simply put the method name, and then in parentheses, you provide each of the variables, followed by a close parentheses and a semicolon. If there's no parameters at all inside the method, you just put simply close parentheses, open parentheses, and close parentheses. Let's now build our own methods. Here we are back in MonoDevelop, and we're back looking at our player object. Right here, you can see we have our 3 public variables. Now, in the last video, I mentioned about you necessarily don't want to make your variables public. You don't want to have other objects interfacing directly with your internal state of your data. There's one reason, of course, is you don't want someone to change the internal state of the data, but also you may change the way how that data is stored. And if someone is directly accessing the score object or the lives object, and you want to change how you calculate that, you can't do that. You're going to break the rest of your code. So what we do is we encapsulate all this behind methods. And we're going to write these methods right now. So for example, we're going to take the score and we're going to make this private now. Of course, this is going to break the rest of my code. And this is an example of brittle code. We want to avoid that, which is why we're writing these methods. So the first method I want to make is a method that will set the score. And I'm declaring this as public. And since we're setting a value, we don't necessarily want to return anything, in which case I'm going to make this a void. Now I'm going to give this a name, and I'm going to call this set score like this. And now I'm going to pass in a new score, like so. So here's this right here is my method signature, and everything down here is my method body. From here, I can now set the score itself. Because this is private, we're going to switch this back to score. Now we have an interesting problem. We have a parameter called score, and we have what is known as an instance variable, because this variable references the instance, is inside this instance, called score as well. What happens is that this parameter now is what is known as hiding this instance variable. When we reference score here, we're not referencing this score, we're referencing the score in here. This is a bit confusing, and the way you can avoid this type of confusion is by using the this keyword. You simply type this score, meaning the score this is referencing this object here, this struct player, and we're referencing this version, and we're referencing this score right here, this variable here, and then we're going to assign it score. So this is being assigned to this, and we're doing it by using the this keyword. Next, we're now going to get this value. So we can type public void. Actually, we're returning an int, so we're going to type public int instead. And now I'm going to call this get score. And again, notice my capitalization, and that's because this is a public variable. And I'm not going to pass in any parameters into this because I just want to get the score. I don't want anything to happen with it. So I'm just going to do get score like so. And then I will simply now return a value. How do we return a value from a method? Well, we use the return keyword like so. We type return, and then we return the score. Now we can do this. The compiler is smart enough to recognize that this is the score, but I tend to just simply use this anyhow. This score. I'm returning the internal variable of score, and this way there's no confusion. Again, you can get away by simply returning score. It's the time you typically you need to use this, and there are also many other cases where you have to use this as well, is when a parameter basically obscures the instance variable. Okay, let's build this, and we're going to get some compilers. Oops, we got to add a semicolon there. And you can see here, we're trying to set a score now, but we can't because it's encapsulated. When we look back here, this is private. So now objects cannot no longer change the score. And this is great because if we change the way how we want to calculate the score, we can now do it within these two methods. We're no longer just simply setting it inside a public field that anything can access. This gives us the flexibility to change. Okay, let's come back here, and now we're going to set the score to 100. We'll say player 1, and we're going to type set score, and this is how we call a method. We put in our parentheses, and then we do it like so, 100. And now I'm going to build and run, and this will work. Well, this actually won't work exactly as we expect because we're still referencing the public field here. Now we can get score, like so, and we'll run this. And you can see here, this will work exactly as before. Now let's run. Let's select our cube. We'll deselect it. And here we go. Here's our Barney. Our score is 100. We're doing this all through methods, but the data is still the same. Now let's create another variable. Let's call this score variable. Here, to avoid confusions, we'll just call this a score. And we're going to set this to 100. Now let's go down here, and we're going to copy and paste this method. We're going to put it underneath here. And now we're going to pass in this variable like so. So now we're passing in 100 into this score. And let's just do something a little bit different. Let's say we're going to set this score equals score plus 1. So we're going to increment this by 1. So this is being passed into this method here. And then inside of this method, we're adding 1 point to it. Now, based on what I talked about methods, what do you think the value of a score is going to be? This method increases that value. Well, let's find out. Let's print it out. Debug log a score. Let's say a score is. So what was the answer? What do you think it will be? Let's find out. Let's start our game, and let's uncheck this cube. Well, we don't have to. It says a score is 100. Can you guess what happened? Well, the value of 100 was copied into this method here. Then that copy was increased by 1 and assigned to this variable here. This value, 100, was never touched. It was just copied. That is why it is still 100. That's very important to know when working with methods in the future. Okay, and now onto your task. For your aliens class, I want you to take this and convert all these fields to use getters and setters, meaning get point value, set point value, get hit points, set hit points, get is alive, and set is alive. And then once you do that, you should be able to access it the same way using Hello World. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And as always, if you found this useful, feel free to give it a good thumbs up. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. See you then.